Animation is supposed to be safe, right? Cute characters, colorful songs, and lessons about friendship. But sometimes Hollywood forgot the memo. These weren't just odd cartoons. They were full-blown nightmares disguised as family entertainment. Parents stormed theaters, censors stepped in, and whole countries pulled the plug. What happens when an art form built for children suddenly veers into the dark side? Stick around, because these animated films will make you rethink what too much really means. Fritz the Cat, 1972. Let's start with the elephant in the room, or rather, the cat. Fritz the Cat wasn't just disturbing, it was revolutionary, chaotic, and downright banned in more places than most horror films. Based on Robert Crumb's underground comic, this movie was marketed as a wild, edgy alternative to the safe world of Disney. But instead of singing animals, audiences got a chaotic, feverish plunge into urban America in the early 70s. Here's the thing. People expected a rebellious cartoon. What they didn't expect were graphic depictions of street violence, caricatures of social unrest, and imagery that pushed far beyond anything parents had ever seen in a cartoon. Kids saw posters with a smiling cat and thought it was the next Felix. Instead, families walked out of screenings in shock, and theaters quickly realized they had something too hot to handle. Censors went after it hard. Some cities refused to show it, and others slapped it with restrictive ratings that kept anyone underage out. Parents' groups declared it dangerous. Critics were split. Some called it groundbreaking satire, while others accused it of being little more than exploitation in animated form. Either way, the film was banned outright from being marketed as children's entertainment, and its reputation as the cartoon that broke the rules was cemented. Why does it matter now? Because Fritz the Cat changed how people looked at animation. It proved cartoons didn't have to play by family rules, but it also showed the price of crossing those lines. Today, it's remembered less as a fun watch and more as a case study in how far a medium can stretch before someone pulls the cord. Heavy Metal, 1981. If Fritz opened the door, heavy metal smashed through it with a flamethrower. Marketed as a mind-bending anthology of science fiction and fantasy tales, this movie turned Saturday morning animation into a psychedelic explosion of monsters, cosmic battles, and imagery that looked like it belonged on a rock album cover. But make no mistake, this wasn't for kids, even though plenty of curious teenagers snuck in thinking it was just another cartoon. The film was built like a series of short stories, each with its own bizarre universe. One segment dropped you into a futuristic city crawling with crime. Another hurled you into a barbarian wasteland where warriors fought to the death. Spaceships, demons, grotesque villains, and nightmare fuel galore, the kind of stuff no child should be watching at 10 a.m. on a Saturday. Yet the animation was so colorful, so slick, that it tricked some parents into thinking it was safe. Big mistake. Controversy hit fast. Critics blasted it for its unrelenting violence and bizarre imagery. School boards refused to let it anywhere near classrooms. Some countries rated it so harshly that its distribution stalled, and certain TV networks banned it from late-night airings entirely. Even within the United States, screenings were heavily restricted. But here's the twist. While censors fumed, fans adored it. Heavy metal built a cult following that still thrives today, with collectors trading VHS tapes and digital restorations. It proved that animation could be raw, edgy, and designed purely for adults, but at the cost of alienating families who thought animation was a safe zone. In the end, heavy metal wasn't just a cartoon gone wrong. It was a warning shot that animation could hit harder, darker, and weirder than anyone ever expected. And for many parents, it was the day they realized not every animated film belonged in the family room. Watership Down, 1978. Don't let the fuzzy rabbits fool you. Watership Down looked like an animal adventure in the spirit of Disney's Bambi. Instead, it delivered blood, terror, and one of the most haunting animated experiences ever made. Based on Richard Adams' novel, the film follows a group of rabbits escaping their doomed warren to find a new home. Sounds gentle, right? Wrong. What unfolds is a violent, emotional survival story that scarred an entire generation of children. The rabbits aren't just running from foxes or farmers. They battle each other, claw to claw, in vicious fights shown in graphic detail. One rabbit is snared in a trap and left to die, gasping and bleeding. Another hallucinates in a nightmare sequence filled with apocalyptic imagery. For kids expecting cuddly woodland creatures, it was pure trauma. Parents dragged their children to theaters thinking it was safe family fare, only to flee when the blood hit the screen. The outrage was instant. Britain gave it a U rating, meaning suitable for all audiences, which only made matters worse. Children's matinees turned into mass crying sessions. Complaints poured in for years, and broadcasters later had to slap warning labels on TV showings. In America, the film faced similar protests. Schools banned it, and some networks refused to air it at all. Yet despite the bans, Watership Down has endured as a dark masterpiece. Animators praised its artistry, and adults later recognized its deep allegory about survival and tyranny. Still, for countless kids of the 70s and 80s, the film became a personal horror story. Ask around, and you'll find someone who still shudders at the phrase "Watership Down." It's proof that sometimes the scariest things don't come from monsters, they come from the stories you least expect. The Plague. Dogs, 1982. If Watership Down was unsettling, The Plague Dogs went even further. Made by the same team, this film followed two dogs who escaped from a brutal animal testing lab. What starts as a tale of freedom quickly becomes a bleak, relentless descent into suffering and despair. These weren't cartoon mutts chasing frisbees. They were traumatized survivors, scarred by experimentation, and hunted like criminals. From the opening scene, the tone is brutal. The dogs endure drowning tests, starvation, and medical cruelty. Their escape isn't triumphant, it's desperate. They wander through desolate landscapes, rejected by humans, and stalked by military forces convinced they're carrying a deadly disease. Any shred of hope gets crushed by another wave of violence or fear. For children, it was unbearable. For adults, it was barely easier. Censors stepped in quickly. Theatrical releases were trimmed, and several countries refused to distribute it at all. Schools banned it from libraries, and broadcasters avoided it completely. Advocacy groups condemned it as inappropriate, and even fans of Watership Down found it overwhelming. In America, it slipped into limited release before disappearing into cult status, only resurfacing decades later on home video. Why did it matter? Because The Plague Dogs shattered the idea that animation had to be family-friendly. It proved the medium could be used to tell stories as harrowing as any live-action drama. But for kids who stumbled across it, the film was nothing short of a nightmare. Today, it's remembered less as a classic and more as a haunting warning. Not every animated story is meant to comfort you. Coonskin, 1975. Now we step into one of the most controversial animated films ever made. Coonskin, directed by Ralph Bakshi, blended live action with animation to create a blistering satire of race, crime, and American culture. But instead of being hailed as daring art, it ignited protests, walkouts, and bans across the country. The movie tells the story of three characters, a rabbit, a bear, and a fox, navigating a corrupt, violent urban landscape. Bakshi aimed to lampoon stereotypes by exaggerating them, but many audiences didn't see satire. They saw exploitation. Civil rights groups protested screenings, declaring the film offensive. Some theaters canceled showings before the reels even hit the projector. In New York, demonstrators lined up outside venues with picket signs, forcing police presence at premieres. The reaction was so heated that Coonskin was pulled from circulation in several cities. TV stations refused to air it, and distributors distanced themselves. Bakshi defended the film as anti-racist, claiming critics misunderstood its intent. But the damage was done. The film's reputation became one of infamy, more talked about for the protests than the animation itself. What makes Coonskin stand out is that it wasn't marketed as children's entertainment, but because it was animated, kids inevitably stumbled upon it, and for those who did, the violent imagery and exaggerated stereotypes were shocking and confusing. Parents panicked, advocacy groups raged, and censors buried it. Over time, Coonskin has been reevaluated by some as a daring piece of underground cinema, while others still consider it an offensive disaster. Either way, it was banned for decades from most television airwaves, ensuring it became one of the most infamous animated films in American history. It's the perfect example of how one creator's bold vision can tip straight into public outrage. Rock and Rule, 1983. Imagine a Saturday morning cartoon colliding head-on with a rock concert from another dimension. That's Rock and Rule. Made in Canada but distributed heavily in the US, this film looked like a colorful animated musical on the surface. Instead, it turned out to be a post-apocalyptic fever dream filled with demons, decayed cities, and themes so dark that parents stormed out of screenings demanding refunds. The plot follows a mutated rock star named Mock, who schemes to summon a demon using music as the key. His target is a young singer whose voice can unlock the gateway to destruction. What could have been a campy rock fantasy instead descended into shadowy, grotesque imagery, glowing pentagrams, crumbling cities, and a climax that felt more like a horror film than a cartoon. Add in music from bands like Cheap Trick and Debbie Harry, and you had a soundtrack kids loved paired with visuals that left them with nightmares. American distributors panicked. Marketing teams didn't know what to do with it. Was it a cartoon for teenagers, for adults, for fans of Saturday morning animation? Nobody could decide. When confused parents took children expecting a rock and roll adventure, the backlash was instant. Some theaters canceled screenings. Others cut promotional materials entirely. By the time it hit television, censors chopped up whole scenes, making the story nearly incoherent. Today, Rock and Rule has cult status, but its legacy is crystal clear. Even rock operas can go too far. It was banned from being shown in many children's programming blocks, branded as unsuitable, and quietly shelved by networks that didn't want to explain the imagery. The movie wanted to be edgy. It ended up being infamous. The Secret of NIMH, 1982. Here's the twist. This one was marketed as a family movie. Don Bluth, a former Disney animator, wanted to prove he could make a darker, more serious film than his old studio. What he delivered was The Secret of NIMH, a gorgeously animated but genuinely terrifying story about genetically altered rats, mystical experiments, and a desperate mother trying to save her child. The visuals are breathtaking but also nightmarish. Rats with glowing eyes scheme in candlelit chambers. Villains strike with claws and teeth. Scenes of animal cruelty are hinted at with shocking intensity. For children who went in expecting another Aristocats, this was horror disguised as heroism. Parents complained of kids having nightmares for weeks after. Some theaters faced protests for not warning families about the film's dark content. Television networks took notice. When The Secret of NIMH was scheduled for family programming slots, watchdog groups demanded edits. Whole sequences of violence were cut. In schools, film libraries blacklisted it for being too frightening. By the mid-'80s, it carried a reputation, beautiful but banned from the youngest viewers. Ironically, critics loved it. Adults praised the artistry and serious storytelling. Over the years, it has become a cult classic, celebrated as one of Don Bluth's finest works. But that doesn't erase its impact on kids of the time. Many remember hiding their faces during the climax or begging their parents to turn off the TV. The lesson? Sometimes the scariest films are the ones that look the friendliest on the surface. Twice Upon a Time, 1983. Now for a film that almost vanished into obscurity. Twice Upon a Time was an experimental animated fantasy produced with George Lucas's involvement. It used a unique technique called l'image, giving the animation a surreal, collage-like feel. On paper, it was supposed to be whimsical. In practice, it terrified and confused its audiences. The story pits dream makers against nightmare makers, with characters slipping between worlds of fantasy and horror. But instead of light-hearted adventure, kids got grotesque villains, nightmarish landscapes, and a tone that felt relentlessly bleak. One villain, Scuzzbopper, resembled a grotesque puppet that haunted young viewers long after the credits. What made things worse was the film's release chaos. Some versions included darker edits with harsher jokes and more disturbing sequences. Parents who stumbled on late-night broadcasts were stunned to see their children glued to something so unsettling, Complaints rolled in, and TV networks quickly shelved it. Schools refused to include it in film programs, and for years, Twice Upon a Time existed mostly as a whispered memory among kids who swore they saw something horrifying on television, but could never find it again. Today, the film has resurfaced on streaming and home video, but its legacy remains messy. For many, it represents that strange moment in the 80s when studios experimented with animation in ways that left parents furious and children traumatized. It wasn't banned because of gore or explicit content. It was banned because it felt wrong, and sometimes that's enough. Wizards, 1977. Ralph Bakshi wasn't finished shaking up animation. After Fritz the Cat and before Lord of the Rings, he unleashed Wizards, a bizarre fantasy that blended fairies, post-apocalyptic war zones, and even Nazi imagery into one surreal package. Parents expecting a harmless magical quest quickly realized they were in way over their heads. The story sets up a world where technology and magic collide. On one side, a kindly wizard named Avatar fights for peace. On the other, his evil brother Black Wolf harnesses old propaganda films and armies of mutants to wage war. Yes, you heard that right. Actual Nazi footage was spliced into the film, projected as a weapon of mind control. Imagine dragging your kids to a cartoon and suddenly seeing swastikas filling the screen. That's what happened. The violence was just as shocking. Armies of goblins and mutants were mowed down in bloody battles. Characters died on screen, not with a quiet fade-out, but in explosions and fiery blasts. For kids raised on Disney magic, Wizards felt more like a war documentary filtered through a fantasy lens. Censors didn't know what to do with it. Some countries slapped harsh ratings on it, keeping it far from school screenings. Television stations refused to air it without cuts. Critics were split down the middle. Some hailed it as daring, others condemned it as irresponsible. Bakshi argued he was telling an allegory about war and peace, but the imagery left little doubt. This was not for children. Over time, Wizards built a cult following, admired for its experimental visuals and bold story. But it was also quietly banned from children's programming and often shelved in libraries. For kids who accidentally watched it, the shock was unforgettable. It's proof that when fantasy takes a dark turn, it can leave scars that no magic spell can erase. Fire and Ice, 1983. If Wizards was wild, Fire and Ice was a full-on fantasy nightmare painted to life. Directed by Ralph Bakshi and inspired by legendary illustrator Frank Frazetta, the film looked like a moving heavy metal album cover, muscle-bound warriors, dark sorcery, and landscapes dripping with menace. But make no mistake, this wasn't a Saturday morning cartoon. The story revolves around the evil sorcerer Necron, who literally moves glaciers to conquer kingdoms, and the heroes who rise to stop him. On the surface, it's a straightforward good versus evil tale, but the execution was brutal. Characters were slaughtered on screen, armies burned, villains tortured their captives. And unlike typical fantasy, this was presented with a grim realism that made every stab, every fall, every scream hit harder. Parents were outraged. They thought an animated fantasy might be safe. After all, dragons and warriors usually meant harmless adventure. Instead, Fire and Ice delivered an intensity closer to live-action war epics. It wasn't just violent, it was relentless. Critics slammed it as too extreme for young audiences. Schools refused to screen it, and some networks outright banned it from programming blocks. Despite the backlash, fans of fantasy art praised it as one of the most faithful translations of Frazetta's style to the screen. Its rotoscoped animation gave characters an eerie realism that only made the dark imagery more unsettling. For children who stumbled on it, it was like watching a nightmare unfold in slow motion. Motion Fire and Ice stands as one of the clearest examples of animation being treated like live action, raw, bloody, and merciless. And for censors, that was enough reason to keep it far away from kids. Cool World, 1992. If there was ever a film that tricked parents into thinking it was safe animation, Cool World was it. Marketed as a kind of edgy Who Framed Roger Rabbit, this movie turned out to be one of the most chaotic, confusing, and inappropriate animated films ever aimed at the wrong crowd. Directed by Ralph Bakshi, once again the king of controversial animation, It blended live action with animation in a way that unsettled both kids and adults. The story follows a cartoonist who gets sucked into a bizarre alternate universe called Cool World, where animated characters called Doodles run wild. The world is grotesque, neon-colored, and filled with surreal, unsettling imagery. Instead of the playful cartoon antics audiences expected, they got warped, sexualized characters, violent slapstick, and a plot so confusing even critics admitted they had no idea what they just watched. Parents were furious. The film's marketing made it look like a funky hybrid adventure that kids might enjoy, especially with its colorful posters and animated leads. But once families sat down in the theater, outrage followed. Complaints flooded in about the tone, the imagery, and the fact that this was marketed anywhere near a younger audience. Censors and networks didn't take long to act. The film earned restrictive ratings in some countries, and American broadcasters outright refused to air it during family slots. School libraries and youth programs kept it far from their catalogs. Instead of being remembered as a fun experiment, Cool World became infamous as a total misfire that left children disturbed and parents livid. Over the years, it has gained a cult following as a so bad it's fascinating curiosity. But its place in history is clear. Cool World was marketed like a cartoon dream and delivered like a surreal nightmare. It's the perfect cautionary tale of what happens when animation crosses lines that family audiences never expected. American Pop, 1981. If you thought cartoons were just for fairy tales and talking animals, American Pop was the movie that threw that idea straight out the window. Directed by Ralph Bakshi, yes, the same mind behind half the entries on this list, it was a sprawling four-generation saga of one immigrant family chasing the American dream through music. Sounds inspiring, right? Except, this wasn't a feel-good sing-along. It was a gritty, unfiltered journey through the darkest corners of 20th century history. The film followed one family across decades, from vaudeville stages to jazz clubs, from World War battlefields to the psychedelic 60s, and into the gritty rock and roll scene of the late 70s. The animation used rotoscoping, which gave the characters a startling realism. That realism made the violence and bleakness hit even harder. Characters weren't cartoon caricatures. They looked and moved like actual people, which only amplified the film's raw edge. And here's where the controversy exploded. American Pop didn't hold back on showing the ugly side of life. It touched on war, crime, poverty, addiction, and personal ruin, all portrayed with a seriousness that left parents horrified. Many had taken their kids expecting a colorful musical history lesson. What they got instead was a brutal adult drama wearing the mask of animation. Ratings boards clamped down. The film earned restrictive classifications, and networks banned it from daytime or family programming. Some theaters even refused to screen it altogether, arguing that animated films would always attract children, whether intended or not. Parents' groups demanded warnings, calling it unsafe for all minors. By the time the dust settled, American Pop had secured its reputation as a powerful but polarizing piece of work. Today it's admired as a bold experiment, proof that animation can tell sweeping emotional stories about real life. But it also serves as a reminder. Not every animated movie is meant for kids, and if you stumbled into American Pop as a child, you probably learned that lesson the hard way. So, there you have it, 12 animated films that proved not every cartoon belongs in the playroom. From brutal rabbit battles to rock operas gone wrong, these movies shocked parents, baffled critics, and scarred kids who thought they were in for something fun. Which of these would you dare to re-watch today? Drop your pick in the comments, hit subscribe for more strange Hollywood deep dives, and remember, animation might look harmless, but sometimes it hides the darkest stories of all.